which is called Bella, and it was published by Wild Pressed Books. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. Some of the ideas that kind of underpin the novel, some of the ideas that I think around in terms of place writing and in terms of setting. And as well as that, I'm going to give you a bit of a reading from the novel as well. So I think I'll do that first, and then we'll jump into the main body of the talk. So Bella is a novel that's loosely based around a local legend in the Black Country, and well, it's a local myth, but it's also part true crime. At the back end of the Second World War, a group of scouts went out hunting eggs and collecting eggs in the Hagley Woods, just on the outside of Stourbridge and Hagley and Halesowen. And in their hunting, they came across the hulk of a tree. And looking in that hulk, they found the skeletal remains of a woman. And there were a few other really odd bits of information that they found along that as well. There was only one shoe found around the site. A jawbone was broken. There was a piece of cloth or some kind of material stuffed down her neck, or one hand was missing as well. And around the same time, graffiti started to appear around the region. Graffiti that said, "I know who put Bella in the wych elm," and "Who put Bella in the wych elm?" And to this day, no one has ever figured out who she was, who put her there, who killed her, and no one knows anything about the mystery, really. But it's yielded enormous amounts of interest, and has summoned quite a lot of really interesting conspiracy theories that range from Cold War espionage to occult sacrifice and satanic rituals gone awry. And all of this kind of feeds into this sort of part myth and part true crime story that I was first attracted to. And it's the open-endedness and the never knowing the beginning and end of that I was really drawn to begin with. So that's the sort of background of that. As I move into the main body of my talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how these kind of stories have a significant impact on communal identity, and how they kind of weave their way into place as well. But before I do that, I'm going to read you the opening section of Bella. Bella. You call me Bella. I'm always here, lurking. I'm just out of sight, just out of reach. I am the mar. I am the foxy infraction, never living, never dead. A shade that germs into and out of you. Michelle. I don't believe in witches or ghosts or whatnot, but there was something about Saltwells and Bella in one form or another. It was always there. Tim said he was an atheist, but he still day walk under ladders and he hated black cats. It's the same with Bella. Even if you think it's just a story, you still don't want to test it. Tim said he knew what happened. I needed to know. I remember driving up from the Delph towards Cradley, and we were stopped at the lights top of Quarry Bank. Tony was with me, and he pointed it out. It's a crossroads here, and it's all concrete, brick, tarmac. It's grey, cold, and stony. Back in the day, they'd make nails and chain if you went down one road. Then they'd make glass if you turned around. Most of that had died out, so it was just a shadow of a place. a junction just used to get somewhere else. The lights at Quarry Bank and four ways with 3 lanes at each opening. It's busy with people heading to the shops, to work. It's always busy and you never get across. You've always got to wait. It ain't nothing except a border between a couple of places that ain't proper towns, any road. Tony was with me, and he said it. See, round here, we're always looking back. We're built from what come before us. Chains, steel, nails, soot and smoke in the skies. Most of it's gone now. We've still got red bricks and concrete, corrugated metal and all that. But we ain't got forges. We ain't got mystic blacksmiths. We got almost barren high streets. We got slick glass, brass and plastic we're built over the works with, stock in rows of dead-headed credit controllers, PPI reps, retail consultants. We've got Merry Hill, an indoor town that spreads out in sanitised pound zones. Then there's what's left over. Little dry suburbs that sink between hills, where dead factories wrapped in weeds, and big housing estates all wet and grey and all punctured in electric light. Them no-go zones unless you're from there. Each zone has its own half-deserted labour club, its own brand of menacing teen, its own bit of cut or brook or strange patch of green land that mopes between a terrace row and the mechanics. Tony was with me, and he said it. Poking out through a crack in the curb was a thin green vine, and on the vine were tiny green tomatoes. Tony said it was like Detroit, how it was once the biggest industrial hub in the US, how nature had started to claim back the city, now it had run its course. There was something frightening about that. It come out of the ground, and that's what they're meant to do, but the ground was meant to be controlled by us, not weeds. I wondered what else was lurking under our industry, waiting to come back. It made me think of salt wells and where we'd play when we was kids. Who put Bella down the witch elm? It was everywhere, this tag, chalked up over the red and grey bricks on our estate. This question, this warning. Most of us had got used to it. Just walked past the signs on the Renner, down Cinderbank or Lodge Hill, like it was just another daily blot on a daily blotted place. Bella was a wench who'd been found in salt wells one night, It was dead. Just bones. Had been stashed there donkeys ago, and no one had ever find out how. So a bunch of them had started painting it up on all the walls of the old factories. Who put Bella down the witch elm? When I says donkeys ago, I mean before the steelworks closed and before buses stopped coming through and before job shop queues. It wasn't on our lot. It was before they'd built houses on the Sledmere. Nan had said it went back to when they was kids in the 50s. Some of them, the old uns in Turners, would say it was saft, just a local story dads had used to shut the kids up. But some of them said it happened just like the story said it had. After a night of supping in the pub, one of them old sorts boatmen and tinkers used, not like Turners or the Oak, where we'd sink shit-tasting shots and bark along to karaoke tracks. An old one like Pardo's, with wood and brass and open fires. Bella had had her fill and stumbled home. I must have got lost because I ended up facing the wrong way in Saltwells, and maybe I was followed, and maybe I'd pissed someone off, or maybe I fancied a bit of one of the scrap men or something, because I wore alone. Whoever had been there and why ever they'd been there, we don't know. We just know they'd fucked her, took a stone or something to her head and cut her up. Years later, a few kids from Derby End Scouts had gone out tracking or something, and they looked inside this big old tree, a witch elm. It's still there too. Most of Saltwells is thin, light-coloured trees and bushes. There's big ones too, but not like the witch elm. Most of Saltwells is paths, and it would have been back in the 50s, I reckon. You can follow the paths down the quarry and through the bluebells, and you wouldn't have thought you were still in Netherton, with all the greens and browns and the almost quiet. You got to know where to find the witch elm. It's on paths. You cut through a thicket up by where it meets the res, and you follow the skinny route made out of the bits of the broken ground made by a few broken sorts who went looking. The witch elm sort of sits in a circle where nothing else grows around it. It ain't tall, but it's fat. It's dark and leafless and brittle. It's got a big laceration down the front. That's where they found her. Them scouts looked inside and pulled out a cracked up skull. Then the police found bits of old shoes and cloth and a few other bones around the circle of ground. But it had been too long and no one knew who'd been there or why or nothing. So the funny fuckers around here started writing who put Bella down the witch elm on all the walls. I don't even know where the name Bella comes from. I guess under our skin too, Bella does. Like the tomatoes finding roots in cracked concrete. So that's the opening section of Bella. And from here, I will hopefully be able to share my screen and bring up to my talk. Now, I can't see anybody now, but I mean, Verity, can you give me a little verbal?
We can see your screen, Rob. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Super duper. Right, I'll crack on then. Okay, so the position with this really is that I'm thinking about the Black Country as a liminal, an in-between, an off-kilter landscape. And within that in-between off-kilter landscape, it becomes ripe for narratives of transgression, of subversion, of non-traditional roots, of playfulness, and indeed haunting. And this is something that the local writer and novelist Kerry Hadley Price picks up on in her work. She is a great psychogeographer, one that drifts around and kind of feeds her inspiration with a sense of place, with the genius loci. And she thinks about the Black Country as being a state of mind, as well as it being a physical setting or locale. A sort of borderless, marginal way of being. And she talks about this as being a kind of direct result of its boundaryless qualities. After all, no one really knows where the Black Country begins and ends. And one of the greatest ways of starting a fight in Dudley is to ask, where is the Black Country? But I think it goes further than this as well. It's not just that there's no solid map of the defining area. It's also that the spirit of place found within the post-industrial landscape gives rise to this kind of liminal, off-kilter, odd setting and state of mind as well. But before I get into that with more detail, I want to explain a little bit and give a bit more kind of theoretical basis for why that might be important, and indeed why that might be important from a creative point of view as well. One of the things that I looked up and researched in great detail when writing my novel was the field of study known as environmental psychology. And this is an interdisciplinary field that started in the 60s of philosophers, geographers, social scientists, psychoanalysts, and creatives, are all interested in the clashes and connections between people and place. And it was started by a man called Harold Prashansky, who came up with an idea and the term place identity. And he says this of place identity. He calls it a substructure of self-identity, consisting of memories, ideas, feelings, attitudes, values, preferences, meanings, and concepts of behavior and experience that occur in places that satisfy an individual's biological, psychological, social, and cultural needs. So, place is more than just a dot on the map in the eyes of environmental psychology. And when you think about it through the lens of place identity, it becomes this really ripe, charged space, which is just as complex and just as movable as any other person. And so from a kind of creative point of view, when you consider your setting and your environment that you're writing within, and your story world, with the same kind of attention that you would give any character, you start to lay down the foundations where all of the action comes out of that place as well. So you're not just creating a really kind of deep setting for the narrative to take place. You're also giving it a kind of spirit of place, as it were, and you're giving it you're creating the kind of compost to allow the drama to take place on. Environmental psychology kind of goes a little bit further than this as well. So they think of identity as being sort of, you could imagine it as being a biological organism, say a kind of the sort of moth larvae that collects things as it moves in the undergrowth, collecting things as it goes along. So as we move through our environments and through our locales, we attach and distance ourselves from different things, from history, from memory, from smells and tastes, from heritage, and all those really important signifiers that make a place, that make a town, that make an estate, and make all those things distinctive from other towns and estates and regions as well. And it's this distinctiveness that really starts to imbibe the person with that sense of place identity that Harold Prashansky commented on and thought about. The other important part of this really is that the environmental psychologists, through much of their research over the last few decades, have sort of established that our links to place, our sense of connectedness to place, is really, really vital to our well-being, and really, really vital to how we see ourselves in the world. And so place identity, under the lens of environmental psychology, is as important to our sense of self as our genders, our religions, our ethnicities, our sexualities, and all the things that make a person a person. So, with that in mind, what if you're from a place like the Black Country? And as I mentioned at the top of this talk, a place that's kind of off kilter and in between. Might that kind of give rise to a sort of liminal, in between, off kilter character, either communal or individual? See, the Black Country is a kind of strange mix of green space and grey space. It's not quite rural and it's not quite urban. It's a place where you see the ruins of old industry, of Victorian industry and 20th century industry, and earlier indeed, and as well as that, sites of renovation and redevelopment. So it's a strange mix of new and old, as well as that. Freud might say that this is an uncanny place, a place that's between familiar and unfamiliar, between homely and unhomely, somewhere that might be safe and unsafe in equal measure. So we're not quite north and not quite south. We're not quite rural and not quite urban. So much of the identity of the Black Country comes from its industrial past, but so much of that is now ruined or renovated and built over again. The region kind of stands in the shadow of its bigger and more successful brother Birmingham, and we are definitely not the same as Brummies. We've got our own flag, our own set of dialects. We've got our own sort of institutions, cultural figures, cultural arenas that kind of stand out as symbols of the region. And yet no one can really decide where it begins and ends. And so I would argue, and I think following that kind of environmental psychology route, that this might give rise to a sort of off-kilter sense of self as well within that off-kilter place. Now, in terms of narrative, in terms of creative fiction, what I'm talking about here is shared by the Gothic traditions and indeed the Romantic traditions in literature. Manuel Aguera, in his thick descriptions and the poetics of the liminal in Gothic tales, thinks about the liminal as a defining feature of Gothic literature. And because because when we're within the liminal, we are not one thing or the other. We're in transition between things, between point A and point B, in a physical sense. In a more emotional, social, or spiritual sense, we're, not quite child and not quite adult, or no longer a novice, but not yet a professional. We've been out into the wilderness, but we're not yet returned to the tribe with the important messages. These are the kind of ideas that come about when we think about liminal space, and it's certainly what Aguera points to in Gothic literature as well. Because, of course, it's the liminal locations in Gothic literature, the ghosts, the zombies, the vampires, and many of the other ne'er-do-wells of Gothic traditions spring forth. And indeed, where the everyday is disrupted and gets pulled into the supernatural as well. So it becomes this arena for dissent, revolt, exploration, as well as for doubt, danger, and fear. And this is something that I've noticed in my PhD research that I did for the University of Wolverhampton, in other Black Country writers as well. And it's something that I kind of think about in terms of it being a Black Country Gothic or a post-industrial sublime. Liz Berry's really awesome collection of poems, Black Country, we find ourselves following characters down to the edge of canals and onto the little patches of land where, in between sort of housing estates and things like that, where people, her characters sort of transform in various ways. They become animalistic, they explore themselves and others sexually, and Liz Berry's Black Country in many ways is this kind of recognition of the sort of sublime within the post-industrial landscape that allows for a kind of transgressive or subversive transformation to take place. What you also get this with Anthony Cartwright's work. How I Killed Margaret Thatcher is a great example of this, but also his other novels as well, where we have people struggling to deal with the post-industrial fallout of Dudley, and needing to resort to criminal behaviour or other transgressive acts as well. And my final example on this slide is Mira Sayal's Anita and Me. And this one's really interesting because it's set like right on the edge in a fictional suburb of Wolverhampton, in the kind of country, rural parts of what would have been the rural parts of Wolverhampton anyway. And in this, as the city starts to expand and as the city starts to kind of take over the rural location, as the encroaching modern takes over the industrial past, Anita, the main character in Anita and Me, become there's a sense that she's on a journey, and it's a story of her coming into being, and it's only through that investigation of that liminal landscape that she's allowed to do that, or is enabled to do that anyway. And we see this in Roy McFarlane's work as well. We see this definitely in Joel Lane's work and many other Black Country writers. I'd be interested to know if they think of themselves as a kind of post-industrial sublime or a Black Country Gothic. But for me, they definitely share this sense of investigating the off-kilter and the in-between, and finding fruits there, sometimes rotten ones. And this is why I've set my story, Bella, where I have. It sits between the hypermodern, the main thrust of the narrative, at least, is set in Saltwells, Netherton, and Dudley, and Saltwells and Netherton being particularly important to the story world. So the haunting is right on one side of the haunted woods is the hyper-modern Merry Hill shopping centre. And then on the other side, you've got the very typically Black Country town or suburb of Netherton. And so Saltwells and Bella's homeland becomes this primordial liminal space between those two things. And it's here that she sends out a sort of pulse or a gravity to the curious folk that want to know more, that want to get to the bottom of this very peculiar mystery. And that's what really is at the heart of the novel. It's all drawn out of place and that off-kilterness that you get within the Black Country, that pulls people into these sorts of strange stories. And getting back to kind of the myths and stories of the local woods, if we think about place identity in these terms as well, place identity is built up from family and memory and smells and the famous people that come from towns and the heritage that's located there and the cultural icons and places that are located there. But just as much as all of those are the stories that we tell each other. And for me, at least, Bella is definitely a very important story in terms of Black Country culture and folklore. But it's also one of many examples right across the world of stories of uncomfortable and unusual things happening on the edges of towns and within locales. People that are listening to this now will know of their own stories of local panthers in woods, of yetis and Bigfoots, to take grand examples, of alien sightings. If you think about the more American tradition of it, of people or feral people living in woods as well. And these are quite often always on the edges of the modern and domestic. And I think that's important here as well, is that these stories are on the edge and always threatening to infiltrate. And many of us, including me, really like being infiltrated by them. And it's these stories that really help us, well, maybe help's the wrong word. They are important to our place identity as all the other things that I've mentioned. But what's more interesting with this is that as the stories get passed on from generation to generation, from whisperer to whisperer, they change and mold and pick up information. And so you've got this really important thread of place identity that is constantly morphing as well, exactly like any place and person does. And I'm going to leave you with that thought just before I go on to the final reading of Bella. So I'll let my face once again. Stop share. There we go. So I will finish before we go into our Q&A part with another quick reading, again from Bella and then from Michelle. Time is different. Memory is difficult. Space infinitesimal. You can't function when you're dead. Time slowed down when I was with her. Time was different. I felt an hour become 10 when my tongue tasted her. You get turned around in here. You turn into and out from in here. Coal seams still steam from bell pits, now brambled and birched over. The toddler tears of fire clay seep through the soils where roots fossilized toil. Milk-stained fens hiccup out of almost runs, built from feet daring to step over the edges. In my time, Round Oak thundered through on one side. The Pensnet train clatter-clacked its way throughout. Hingley and other small forges hissed and roared at the other end. Now, I see it changed. It's difficult, but I see it. Where the steelworks were, a shiny, bright and clean space, an indoor town with plastic tile and brass. You come and go like insects. From the remains of Round Oak, still warm before the rust, buds this hanker-saw, sharp, sanitized with slick polish. Instead of taming steel that feeds every chink of our space, you're sold stuff that breeds silkworms over our loot. It chews and mottles larvae through our roots. The forges, whimpering and dormant at Derby End. This, Saltwells, is a primordial beltland bridging the new and the ruined. There are many of us who can't sleep in here. I am here. You call me Bella. Michelle. Bella lingered over us, Bella and the wych elm, like fleshly sewage washed up on a beach. It was a film that slicked over stuff. Sometimes I think we're more so fucking predictable. Just go into Turner's and see us all, old men being old men, young wenches in tracksuits. We judge ourselves as harshly as you lot do, and you ain't no better. Like Grandad, he was tough and he'd sin things, but he'd sin enough to make him know, to make him not want to talk it through. He'd heard enough chat to make him realise that talking they get nothing. Like Carrick, he was tough and he'd sin things too. He'd tried hard to keep things together and be a good man, but life had just turned him the other way. We're all the same, ain't we? Grandad ain't never going to tell us what went on in his life, even though he wants to share. Gemma ain't never going to stop being shy, even though it's beautiful and everyone wants to be with her. Carrick will buy you a drink and ask how you're doing, but underneath there's still a part of him who blames you for his lot and wants to knock it out of your head. I don't know if it's our true self or what, but it's in us and out us. It's lurking. You ain't going to get to the bottom of it. Thank you very much. You can get Bella from all good bookstores and especially the Wild Press Books website.